Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning. We're just continuing to admit people, but it is 10 o'clock, so we will kick off. My name is Elise Kane. I'm one of the policy leads here at NCOSS. I'm joined today by Catherine McGovern, who's going to be running the budget training workshop for us today. So thank you for joining us. I do just want to acknowledge country first. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all dialing in from today and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I'm dialing in from beautiful but slightly wet Camaragal land today. I would also like to acknowledge that this land was never ceded, and I would like to pay my respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are on the line with us today. We are recording the webinar today, and that recording will be made available on our website along with Catherine's slides. So if you're not comfortable being recorded, please do turn off your camera. And you can also ask any questions through the chat or Q&A function as well, if that's more appropriate for you. We will be having time for questions. We will leave it at the end of the presentation. Feel free to put any questions in either the chat or the Q&A function, and I'll facilitate that towards the end of the session. If we run out of time to answer any of your questions, we can also take those offline and email back and forth as well. But with that, we do have limited time, and I know Catherine's got a lot to take us through this morning. So I will hand over to Catherine, Catherine McGovern, who's running the training for us today and has done so for the last couple of years to support us through the budget process. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Catherine. Over to you.
Thank you, and great to see you all this morning. I trust you can actually see my slides. I'm coming to you today, not from New South Wales, but I'm coming from Wurundjeri country down in Melbourne, where it is bright and sunny. So thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to do this again. Elise and I were talking before, and I think it's getting harder to read your budget papers, but I will try and work you through as quickly and effectively as I can. Just a bit about me. I'm a partner at a consulting company, a background in government relations, political staffing, and I've spent the last 25 years of my life in health and social care. I currently sit on the board of the Rural Workforce Agency Victoria, but I've also sat on legal aid in Victoria, disability support, Melbourne City Mission. So my background's really in policy, strategic and political advice, healthcare economics. And as Elise says, we'll probably take questions at the end of this. In the event that there are any questions, as I've said in previous years, I'm happy, if we don't get to them, to take them offline. So in terms of what I'm going to take you through today, I'm actually just going to take you through sort of what the context for the current New South Wales government is, what a budget actually is, how to approach a budget. Anybody who's heard me talk about this before will hear me say, prepare well for a budget. It's really, really critical. And I think the more opaque and challenging budget papers become to read, the more important it is that you really do prepare well for what you're trying to do with them. We're going to look at the budget papers and other budget materials. I think some of those materials are getting more important. About being in lockup, how you use information, some key pitfalls that you find in the budget papers, how to check your information, and then, of course, you have an election next year and what to look for in the preparation and lead up to that. So this is your government's fourth budget, and it's really being framed as economically responsible in terms of the upcoming election. Your Treasurer gave a speech a couple of weeks ago to the McKell Institute, and he really talked about, there aren't going to be pre-election sweeteners. This is all about us being economically responsible, the importance of the renewables to the state's future, and the future of economic growth, families, jobs, businesses, and so forth. Interestingly, he really was very clear about economic slowdown. 6 months ago in the half-year review, they had economic gross state product running at 2.5% growth. That's now, they're forecasting 1% growth, so a significant slowdown. And they really are blaming that on the Reserve Bank, to be frank, and rising interest rates. The budget is fundamentally the mechanism by which governments raise funds. So how do they actually get funds? And then it actually is about how they are intending to spend them. It is the most important annual political, economic, social documents of a government. It tells you what they're intending. It tells you their hopes, their priorities, what they're expecting. It details the top line financial information over 6 years. So it goes back a year and looks at what the actuals were at the 30th of June for 2025. It will look at what they estimate they will be. Obviously, they don't have the final figures for the year we're in at the moment. They forecast ahead into what's called the budget year, so 30 June 26 to 30 June 27. And then looks at the following 3 years, which are called the forward estimates. You'll often hear people talk about that when talking about a budget. So those 6 years are presented together in many instances, although I'll give you an example later of where they didn't do that. It indicates government priorities, as I said, what services they're providing. You can also find which ones they're cutting, although that's obviously harder because governments try to position this as a good news story, not as a we're cutting anything. But it's really important about how they're spending your money. And I want to reiterate that this is your money. It's your friend's money. It's your family's money. So when it comes to asking questions about it or trying to work out what government's doing about it, that is actually a responsible activity, and you should be trying to work out how governments are doing that. There are parallel processes in the budget. You're reporting against, as I said, the current year's budget as well as last year's budget. You're talking about the budget year ahead, and you're also looking at priorities for next budget. So you're actually getting ready. The pre-budget process is getting ready for next year's budget, which in your instance will be just after your next election. Don't read these budget materials in isolation, especially if you're looking for changes, because they all interlink. And I'm going to work you through an example of that later. But it's really important to think of budget papers as a continuum in a government, particularly when you've got the same government delivering them. Actually, changes can be found by looking through those. So as I said, they've got statements of intent about how government is going to spend money and how they're going to raise it. The New South Wales government has the Performance and Wellbeing Framework, which is trying to measure outcomes. So what are they actually delivering for the money that they're spending? This is a new framework. It was started it came into effect last year, but it actually started its development a couple of years before. There are policy statements, accounts that relate to those, and also importantly, the underlying financial assumptions about what does a government think interest rates are going to do? What do they think growth will do? And we've just had that example of the 2.5% going to 1% over the last 6 months. That actually impacts how much money a government's going to have. It also, interest rates indicate how much money they're going to have to pay in debt. So they're things that might move in the budget over the next year. And you might read some of those assumptions and just think they're not relevant, they're not right, they're the wrong assumptions. And that flows into the budget. If the government thinks that interest rates are going to be 5%, and you think they're going to be 7%, that means that debt repayments will be higher. There'll be less money for other things. So I cannot say this enough about a budget. Prepare well, plan ahead. Really think about what you're trying to do with a budget. Think about why you're reading the budget. What are you interested in the budget? Where have those issues been in previous budget papers and materials? What happened last time? Did the government forecast something? Did that actually happen? Were those projects delayed and so forth? And also think about what you might think might happen this time from either your discussions with the government or, governments now often flag things well in advance, like the McKell Institute speech. What's been announced already? What do you think might happen? That can all help you prepare for what you're looking for. And why are you interested in the government, in the budget? Are you actually trying to talk to government about, use it for advocacy? Are you trying to update your members or stakeholders, tell your board what's happening, communicate or launch a media campaign? And what are you going to do with the information? Are you actually writing briefing notes to media, to members? Are you writing media releases? Are you doing board papers to people? If you are doing any of those things, prepare an outline or a template of those in advance. It will save you time on the night. It will mean that you get your material out to people earlier. So actually just prepare a template, prepare an outline, write a list of what you're looking for. And what are you interested in? Homelessness, disability, mental health, cost of living, health education. If you're lucky enough to have a team, try and allocate those issues to different people so that you actually share the load, because there's a lot of material in a budget. Or alternatively, actually work with other colleagues or peers in other organisations. If you've got a colleague and a friend in a different organisation, you're interested in the same thing, actually try and work together if you've got shared interests. It just shares the load. It gets a different set of eyes on budget papers. It will really help you in that regard. Work out where your issues are likely to be in the budget materials. What portfolio are they in? Where were they in last year's budget papers? If they're new or you're hoping for new programs, which portfolio are they in again? And where do you think they would fit in terms of last year's papers? What's in last year's papers is not foolproof, but it's usually a good indicator of where something will be reported in this year's budget papers. So you're going to have to look at last year's budget materials. What did they say would be spent over the forward estimates? What has been made? What announcements have been made since? And what changes can you track through those different papers? So what does 2024-5 say? What did 2025-6 say? Then what, in next week's papers or the week after's papers, what does 26-27 say? And that's really what you're trying to do to track a difference. So in terms of the sources of information, there's a lot of information. As Elise and I were talking earlier, a lot of announcements are made before the budget now. Governments really like to sort of float things out there, get some good news stories, even floating an idea to see what the reaction will be. So really watch for those in advance. Watch for those speeches. Your treasurer and your government ministers have a really good track record of doing big pre-budget speeches, places like McKell, as your treasurer did recently, but in other institutes in the weeks leading up to budget. And they are often really instructive about what they're thinking. On budget day, you've got the Treasurer's media releases, the budget papers, the budget speech. You've got specific papers like the Plan for New South Wales, which is actually a really good overview as a general rule of the budget. You've also got fact sheets and other materials, often in the department websites, other ministers' press releases. There's media, newspapers, a lot of social and TV. The Department of Community and Justice in New South Wales last year did a series of Facebook, or at least a few Facebook announcements, which on specific programs that they wanted to highlight. Really useful for finding out exactly what they thought their priorities were, but what they were actually spending money on. And there are also other commentaries, and I'll talk about some sources for those later. But the budget speech is also really interesting because it's a good overview about what your government think is important. If you look at the Treasurer's speech last year, he talked about the budget continuing the journey that we started upon in our first, restoring essential services, rebalancing public finances, and laying the foundation for long-term growth. In the budget 1, we reset. In budget 2, we responded. In budget 3, we accelerate. This budget is about investing in the services our people rely on, better hospitals, better schools, and a stronger public sector. So fundamentally, that's where he saw his priority. And I think it's really important just to grab some of those pieces about what government says it thinks it's doing or what it says it's thinking it's trying to do. So the budget papers sometimes change order. Last year, budget paper 2 became the performance and wellbeing statement. budget papers can really show the order in which governments actually think that they prioritise things. So in 2024-25, the infrastructure statement here at number 3 last year was at number 4 and actually came after the agency financial statements. Obviously, last year, infrastructure was a higher priority of the government simply by the number that it took in the budget order. Budget paper number 1 is basically the budget statement. It's an overview of the state's finances over 6 years. Importantly, in New South Wales, it's getting more and more of the measures of the budget in the appendices of the budget. And a lot of the material that I would hope to see elsewhere is now living in there. Budget paper number 2 is the performance and wellbeing statement, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Budget number 3 is the infrastructure statement. Basically tells you what they're trying to spend on infrastructure and projects. Budget number 4 looks at all of those agency financial statements. So actually what the government agencies are and the departments and what their financials are. So if you are a government agency, for example, a legal aid commission, etc., you can actually see your budget is in those papers. Budget paper number 5, I'm going to talk about that one very little in this presentation. It's actually the legislation needed to deliver the budget. And unless you are a lawyer or particularly legally minded, they tend to be quite long sometimes and not particularly informative. They are the mechanism by which this happens rather than the policy behind it. I don't think this year's budget papers will change. I think the government's actually got it into the order that they want it to be. I'm happy to be proved wrong on that, but I think you'll get budget papers number 1 to 5 as on the previous slide. You'll also get the plans for New South Wales, which, as I said, is, I think, a really good overview of the budget and what the government thinks its priorities are. Plan for Western Sydney, plan for regional New South Wales, really separating the state up into these are our priorities. So budget number 1 is really the sort of budget highlights, but also the fiscal position, the strategy, the outlook, the overview of the economic environment. So it will include those things like what does the government expect interest rates to be? What does it think growth will be? What are the government's assumptions about the budget? And also will often identify what they think the risks are to delivering the budget. It has the revenue measures in it, and I'll talk a bit more about those later. It has consolidated expense, revenue balance sheet measures, and it includes new funding. It covers some forward estimates. As I said before, it's over that sort of 3-year period, and then the forward estimates being the 3 years following that. And I think appendices B and C are becoming even more relevant in New South Wales about where the money's actually going. And I'll give you some examples of that later. But if you're actually looking for programs and rebates and more detail, those appendices are getting more important about there's nowhere else some of that information is captured anymore. And I think some of that information is becoming much more opaque, but those appendices are really relevant. Budget number 2, the performance and wellbeing statement. This presents the performance information versus the budget measures by wellbeing and New South Wales outcomes. It's got the old gender equality statement that used to be a separate paper included in it now. And the idea is to actually look at the performance of government services and link it to the wellbeing of the people of New South Wales. It's arranged around wellbeing themes, then outcomes, and we were all expecting that, as per the framework listed below, that government programs and policies would then sit in there. It's been developed over a number of years, but it really didn't change pretty much at all from consultation to first version, despite various commitments by the government that it would. So the wellbeing themes are linked to outcomes, and they're considered to be important to the quality of life of people in New South Wales. So healthy, skilled, prosperous, housed, secure, community, connected, sustainable. So they're the themes. And then there are 28 outcomes that fit below those to track whether those themes are being delivered upon. The framework did not do what most stakeholders wanted it to do. There is no detail on the priorities or government focus. There's no dollars in there about new programs. There's no new programs allocated, and there's just the expected outcomes. I think the establishment of this framework, which I had high hopes for, I possibly should know better, has actually made these budget papers more opaque. And significantly more opaque in your state. Oops, sorry, I'm going to go back there. It's also only really useful if the government commits. So there's a whole variety of things that it's reporting in there that will only really be useful in the event that the government keeps the indicators that it's got in there at the moment being the same indicators. If they change those indicators year on year, so how many children in New South Wales are living in out-of-home care, for example, is one of them, that won't actually be very useful in the longer term if they decide next year they want to measure something else. So it's only really helpful if they do that year on year. And are they the right measures? That's a question. Are they the measures that are relevant to you? That's another question. I can't answer that for you. But from my perspective, I think it's an interesting document. I think it's an interesting exercise. I don't think it necessarily delivers very much useful information. Budget number 3, as I said, that's the infrastructure statement. It looks at how much money is being spent, including the 4-year capital plan. New infrastructure. And new infrastructure is really interesting because pretty much the government reports in priority order. So last year they had climate change, energy and water at the beginning. It's number 1, with community and justice at number 2, education at 5, creative industries and tourism and sport was at number 3, presumably ahead of health, which was at 6, and housing and planning, which was at 7. Now, that changes all sorts of years, but it does give you an idea of where government is focusing. It also links infrastructure to other priorities, and it also tells you what the government's contributing versus what the Commonwealth or other sources of funding. So if you're interested in private sources of funding in infrastructure, this is the budget paper you might want to look at. So budget number 4 is the agency financial statements. It actually looks at the bodies that actually undertake state government activities, departments, but again, all of the other organisations, the Aboriginal Housing Office, Legal Aid, the Office of the Children's Guardian, both the departments and the agencies that fit below them. It also details machinery of government changes, which sounds very dry and in some regards sometimes is. But machinery of government changes is really important if the government decides to shift something from one portfolio to another portfolio or reallocate the responsibilities. So it's always worth checking those, particularly if you can't find something that you're looking for where it was last year. Check that it hasn't been moved, and you'll find that in budget paper 4. Has actually some part of a program been moved from one department to the other? There was a situation a few years ago in the department in federal politics where the government decided to move something in the Department of Health into Services Australia, essentially, which actually ended up with that program actually being killed because Services Australia didn't understand what that program meant and got rid of the people who worked in it, which caused all sorts of other problems. Agency financial statements are really long. I think they came in at 325 pages last year of accounts, so they look quite dry. They are quite important, though, to know whether your agency's being or the agencies associated with you that you work with, whether their money is going up. They've got recurrent and capital expenditure, so you can see whether, yes, the money's going up, but it's actually on capital expenditure, so it might not be on something relevant to a program, or it's recurrent, so is it going to be continuing or not? And they are detailed. If you look at community and justice, there's the department itself, Then there are 12 agencies below that department, and then there are 3 special offices, and the accounts for each of those are detailed in budget paper number 4. So in terms of getting the materials out of the budget papers, look at the budget speech. As I said, it's really good for key announceables and that sort of framing of what narrative the government's trying to tell about its own story. Budget paper number 1 has priorities and top-line financials. With chapter 3 often, and it's not always chapter 3, but it's usually labeled budget priorities, actually saying what the priorities for the budget are. Appendices, look in the appendices for specific measures of the budget. Read the budget overview. What's the plan for New South Wales? What are the things the government, again, wants to really reinforce? That budget paper too, really useful if you're interested in any of the indicators it's reporting on, probably less interesting if you're not. Budget number 4, check it for that agency funding information, and then look at budget papers number 3 and 4 if you're interested in infrastructure, or if you can't find something and you want to check if it's been what we call MOGD, machinery of government changed. So, that's just sort of an overview of where you look for what. Other information sources, as I said, I think your budget papers are becoming less opaque, more opaque, and I think deliberately more opaque. And therefore, I think other information sources are becoming more important and more useful. The budget media releases often have really easily digestible stories about where the money's going. It doesn't tell you what's being cut because your budget releases are about the good story, not about the bad stories. But what are we actually trying to do? And that's easy to find in those. The Treasurer's media releases, other ministers' media releases, anything that the departments put on their website in terms of fact sheets and other materials. And sometimes you can sign up to those in advance. Then there's media. Look at the media, the newspapers, journalists. There are journalists who live for budget lockup and reading budget papers. They write good stories about them and they tend to be really easy to digest. Social media, television, and other commentaries. So there's a lot of organisations who write commentaries on budgets. And I think, again, it's an easy cheat sheet of checking what's happening. Numerous of the PR and government relations agencies, NSCOSS, Newgate, H Advisors, Hawker Britain, GRA Causeway, all write budget analyses. Some of those you can sign up to in advance. Some of those are just blogs on their websites. Many of those are worth looking at just to get an overview and also as a way of checking your own information. Like, is there something in there that you missed that they've picked up? Do you want to check that you've read it right? See if somebody else is reporting the same thing. It can be a good way of seeing. And also then there's the chambers of commerce, the business councils and so forth also report. They obviously tend to be less interested in the social services side of things, but they will often report on trends. Sadly, online budget lockup really does eliminate that interaction with relevant staff that used to be so useful on budget day, of actually being able to haul up a staff member and say, this doesn't make sense on page 40. Can you please explain it to me? It's always a pressured environment just because of the time constraints and everybody's trying to get to the bottom of what the papers really mean. But make the most of it. If you are doing it online, ask any questions if you can. Listen to the presentation really carefully. It does, again, tell you about priorities, and it also tells you about people. I was in a really interesting budget lockup a few years ago at federal level where a minister appeared to give, in the middle of a budget day, to give the presentation that usually the secretary of the department would give in a lockup. I confess my interpretation of that was that the secretary and the minister couldn't stand each other. The minister was stepping in to do the secretary's job and the secretary wasn't long for the job, and that did prove to be right. So actually looking at the politics and the interactions between who's presenting on what, are they actually presenting on their own responsibilities? And the words that they use in those presentations can be really important. If you can, again, get somebody else to listen with you, whether it's a peer or a colleague, or just have those interlinks, particularly in our sector. I think it's really important to work together to see what's happening. And that second set of ears where somebody else might pick up something you miss on the first go round, again, because it is a slightly pressured environment. At the same time, remember that this is the government's budget. It's not the bureaucrats' budget. They advise on the budget. They don't decide, although sometimes that balance can be hard to see. So actually ask them the more technical questions or the intent-based questions rather than the sort of policy of, if you're asking why did you do this? Actually, why did the government want to do this? Because as I said, it's not the bureaucrats' budget. What sort of modelling did they use to get the numbers that they got to? What assumptions did they use? Ask about program cuts. If you think there's a cut to a program, ask if you can, or ask the next day. If there's a grant round, the federal government in their recent budget announced some chronic care funding. How many participants do they expect to get that? It'll give you an idea of how big do they think each grant will be. If they've got $100 million and they're expecting it to go between 20 people, that's a big difference between expecting it to go to 10. What outcomes are expected from the grants or the expenditure? When will the money be spent? Timings of program commencement really matter, particularly for planning in our sectors. So actually asking those sorts of questions can be really useful to try and get to the bottom of the when will the money be spent, what's it for, and who is it expected to go to? So all of this will allow you to build up a picture about what's being announced, and then look about what's been announced before to check if it's actually new spending. Governments are really good at announcing spending multiple times, and I'll talk about an example of that in a minute. Check spending areas to confirm they're continuing. Have the funding numbers decreased? Has funding simply disappeared? Have there been changes in the estimates or the forecasts or the reporting? And then compare that to what you've looked at in advance. Look at what the media, the budget media releases say. Look at other statements and fact sheets, both to check, but also to see any gaps or changes. So governments like to re-announce spending. I'm sure all of you have seen this before. This is not new news. Governments often bundle bits of spending that they've announced during the year and then re-announce it on budget night like it's new spending, when really some of it might be, some of it's not, or sometimes none of it's new. It's all been previously announced. Governments' budgets are designed to hide information, not just share information. Governments change reporting frameworks. As I said, machinery of government is one way, and that can be quite legitimate, but governments can also change how they report things. I think that's probably slightly less likely this year with your government. I think your government's going into an election. They want to look like they're being as transparent as possible. Changing the reporting frameworks sort of at year 4 makes less sense, particularly given that they introduced the performance and wellbeing framework last year. Governments having uplifts in the first year, followed by future year decreases, and we'll work through an example of that in a minute. As I said before, machinery of government changes. The other thing is make sure you check properly. Control F on your computer is really useful. Put in all the terms you're interested in, search the budget papers for all of them, just to make sure you're not missing anything. It's a really quick way, an easy way of making sure that you're picking up everywhere it's mentioned, your term is mentioned, including in the footnotes. Governments like to put things in footnotes. So in terms of just working through an example that Elise and I were talking about previously, in terms of how you can actually track something through a budget, if you look at the cost of living pressures that were announced, the rebates that were announced in the 2024-25 budget, the 2025-26 budget saw these decrease. There was a really early sign of that in the original announcement in budget paper 1. And I'm just going to look at one element of this. I'm just going to look at the energy piece just for ease of explaining. But into the 2024-25 budget, the expanded energy social program actually included a $100 million increase in 2024-25, with the intent of supporting up to 1 million New South Wales households with energy bill relief. Again, it says 2024. It doesn't say it's going to be ongoing. It just says it's going to be 2024, and it says it twice. So the idea that the 2025-26 budget saw these decrease is already flagged in the initial announcement. I think it's always interesting when somebody says up to 1 million households as well, because there's a question there of how many do they really expect? Still in budget paper 1 of 2024-25, in the chapter 5 revenue, you can actually see this again. There are new expenses. They go up in 2024-25, and then they go down in 2025-26, and then again down in 2026-27. They're increasingly anticipated to go down over the forward estimates. So the government's announced various new policy measures, new expenses. They're expecting those to decrease over forthcoming years. That suggests to you that they're going to cut something that they've announced. So that's when you run into your first challenge. You then need to work out where that is. And so the details of the concessional charges, because that rebate was what's termed a concessional charge, and that's outlined when it's named first in the budget. The details is actually in budget paper 1 in appendix 2 on page 2.21. And you can see that it goes up from 22, 23, 24, 24, 25 is mentioned, the low income household rebate. It doesn't tell you what's going to happen in future years. What it does tell you, though, is even though it's a new announceable and it's only one measure in a whole package of measures, that the low income household rebate went from 231 to 225 million over those 2 years, despite the government saying that there was going to be an increase in it. So there is an increase in the overall package, but not in that particular element of that particular package. The amount of money per rebate also went up. So it went up to $350. Now that suggests that that $225 million is going to be shared among fewer people because it's more money. So already you've identified a problem with that particular element of that particular program that you can actually ask somebody about or look at. Then you look, you've done what you can with the budget papers you've got in front of you. They're not forecasting what's going to happen the following years. So the following year in 2025-26, you sit down with that budget and you look for the same piece. It's still in budget paper number 1. It's still under housing and community major concessions. There's still a table on it. This time, though, it's on page C29, not in an A page at all. You can see the actual money that was spent in 23-24. You can see the forecast amount that was spent in 24-25, and you can see what's forecast the next year. Now, they clearly spent more, or they're estimating that they're going to spend more than they did on the page before. Then that number is the same as the year before, but it's still a decrease on what was actually spent. So they're planning to spend $55 million less just on that element of the overall package of rebates between those 2 years. In addition, there's another $9 million sitting down here that they're expecting to spend less of. So you're beginning to get a sense of cuts. So I know that's sort of slightly confusing, but if you work through it really methodically, and you need to be methodical about this, and it's why having your search terms set up and everything, is I would have gone to section A of budget paper 1 in 2025-26 to look for this, and it wouldn't have been there. But it should be in the budget paper somewhere. And rather than rifling through all of the papers, I can just put in housing and community major concessions, and it will bring this table up for me. Once I've got that table, I can then compare it to previous years. So yes, it's complex, but those things of actually being prepared, knowing what you're looking for, and having last year's material ready for you can really make it much easier in terms of working out what's happening in the current year's budget papers. So in terms of checking your information, again, really search by term. It really helps you to make sure you don't miss anything too much. It allows you to check if something's still called the same. As I said, look at other sources of information as well, analyst accounts, other peak bodies, other agencies, newspapers. And don't be afraid to call and ask. Going back to my earlier point, this is actually your money. It's your friend's money. It's your parents' money. It's your community's money. You have the right to understand how your government, who you elect and whose salaries you pay, is choosing to spend it. So call people, call your colleagues, call your peers, call the relevant department and try and find out what's actually happening with your money. And don't be too scared to do it. Don't be ashamed to do it. You really do sometimes just need to pick up the phone and ask the question. And of course, looking forward to an election, I often start this presentation with this slide because I think it's really important to understand the process of a budget cycle. So the budget cycle runs all year. We're in June and we've got the budget. Fundamentally, we're really in the middle of the budget cycle. The announcement of the budget is the middle, it's the announceable part of the budget, but it's actually not where the budget cycle starts. The budget cycle really starts in December when departments and other government agencies are asked to provide to the government what they think they want to spend next year. So they work with their ministers and they do their own budget submissions, just like you might do your budget submission to government. They do theirs internally. There's a whole piece of policy and financial assessment that then goes on from December all the way through until sort of May, to be honest, about analysing that. Portfolios put in their budget submissions, you put in yours, the pre-budget submission, what would you like? What are the mechanisms you'd like to see? Expenditure Review Committee starts meeting, anytime, to be honest, between February and April. That's the committee of the cabinet that actually decides and analyses the budget and helps make the decisions. There's actually then a budget cabinet in May that, agrees the budget, tweaks the budget, actually approves the budget. And the budget in New South Wales is obviously then announced in June, with the aim of getting the appropriations bill that allow the money to come through passed by the end of the financial year so that the money can flow for the following year. There's the budget estimates in August, September time. There's department annual reports in October, which, is another source of information about what's actually happening. Where is the money going? What does the department say that is actually happening within the department about their money and about their programs? And then there's the half-yearly review, which is sort of the half-yearly update about where the government's tracking, what growth forecasts they're using. And also quite a lot of information. It's a good time for governments to make new announceables, as I'm sure many of you have experienced previously. So thinking this time, you guys have an election, it's due next March, but it's also due on Easter Saturday. So your government is there's a mechanism within the legislation that allows them to bring it forward. So they're going to try and bring it forward, I gather, by 2 weeks so that it'll sit in February to avoid that Easter weekend so that people can actually enjoy it rather than have to vote. So, between now and then, you've got budget estimates to get questions asked in budget estimates by politicians of departments. There's an opportunity there if you're trying to find out something or you're trying to niggle into a program. There's an opportunity there. There's the opportunity in the annual reports to actually look at what the department itself is saying. There's the opportunity leading into that half-yearly review of trying to get new measures back up into a government budget. And then there's the whole piece, obviously, in the pre-election cycle early next year, again, of trying to get your measures into the government's priorities. But there's also opportunities in each one of those steps and between now and next February for government to be making announcements about what they're going to do with money, what their priorities are, and so forth. And you really want to monitor those, as well as taking opportunity to get your agenda up. So in terms of monitoring, set up all of your monitoring. I'm sure most of you have already done this, but what are you interested in? Sign up for departmental and ministerial alerts when a minister's making a speech, when the department's making a press release. Put up your newspaper alerts, organize your Google or other AI alerts to make sure that you've got a steady input of information to you about what's happening in your environment. Keeping an eye on whether your ministers make, or your minister or ministers make key speeches, like the one that the Treasurer made to the McKell Institute a couple of weeks ago. Signing up from alerts from those will keep you updated about where ministers are appearing. So you might decide to go along and actually have the opportunity to engage with your minister, but also sign up for alerts of what did they say there, or what are they going to say. And again, that half-yearly review is really important in terms of what's the fiscal and economic outlook looking like. So if the half-yearly review in December comes out really negatively, the state's sliding into greater debt, they think the interest rates are going to go up, gross state product's going to go down, they're basically flagging that they think things are getting worse economically, and that will make getting new budget measures up harder. It's just a flag. There's no reason not to keep going and not to keep trying, but it is a flag about what they think the economy is doing. Here's just some really useful websites, or websites I find really useful when I'm trying to work out what's going on with the budget in New South Wales. Media releases, obviously the budget papers themselves, DCJ's news and media outlets, and all of the New South Wales government ministerial releases. Actually have a look, see where they are, see what's happening with them, set the alerts that you think you need to have on those, and make sure that you're just staying on top of them. And I guess I've been talking a long time, so apologies, and I've done quite a big information dump, but I'm very happy to take questions now. I'll hand over back to Elise and maybe stop sharing my slides. But I'm happy to go back to any that people want me to.
Thanks so much for that, Catherine. As always, really insightful and helpful content, particularly the example that you worked through with sort of tracking the funding around cost of living measures and how you can sort of track specific things. I might kick off with a question that's sort of related to that. I think sometimes the challenge, often the challenge, particularly as we grapple with budget papers that are increasingly less transparent and detailed as each year goes by, is finding that information, specific information within the budget papers that's about a particular program or program area. Sometimes it can be really, really hard to see if there has been cuts to funding for a specific program or program area. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there has or hasn't been, but it's just the information is not in the budget paper at all, which can be very frustrating. In that context, I guess there's two parts to my question. Is there a way to figure out what the government is, any changes in overall spending in a particular portfolio? So in health, for example, in the health portfolio, is there a way to figure that out? And if there is a way to figure that out, is that actually useful for us to know? Like, does it tell us anything useful because it is such a broad, umbrella figure?
I think so. Yes, there's definitely a way to find it out, and that would be in that agency financial statements paper. So you can go through there and actually see what's happening for each department, what's forecast and so forth to happen. And if there's changes, it does at least flag you the opportunity to ask a question. So you can go back into budget paper 1 and look at the measures in budget paper 1 that relate to that portfolio area, and actually track through those measures in the budget priorities and particularly in the appendices, and actually see what measures are listed. It then gives you the opportunity to say to somebody, or go digging and ask questions but from an intelligent perspective. So you're not just saying, where have you cut money? You're saying, we've seen in your budget papers that your department is going to get less money in the following years. We see you're spending more money on this and this measure, which means that there are measures on which you're spending less money. It just means that rather than starting off with a blank sheet, you're starting off from the perspective as somebody who has proven to the person you're asking that you can actually read a budget paper and that you've done your homework. So you start from a place of much stronger credibility with any information. Any information that you've got that you can actually say, but. And if they say, yes, oh, but we're increasing this, this, and this, and you say, yes, well, you've increased those measures by, say, $100 million, but your budget overall is going down by $200 million. So where's that $100 million difference? You know, 300 million difference, sorry. If you've gone up by 100 million in new spending, but your portfolio's gone down by 200, where's the $300 million gap? Is that in staff? Is that in infrastructure? Or is that in a program? And if so, which program?
Thanks, Catherine. I can't see any questions written in the chat or the Q&A function. Is there anyone on the line who'd like to verbally ask? Oh, here we go. I think Jessica has just come through. So thanks so much, Catherine. Is there a full list of reputable organisations who write up commentary about the budget? I know you mentioned NCOSS, GRA Causeway, etc.
Yeah, and there's probably not a full list. I was just mentioning those because I do get emails from those organisations with budget updates. I know NCOSS, you can subscribe to their regular email. They send out an email quite regularly just updating people about what's happening in politics more generally, which is sometimes interesting, sometimes less relevant to whatever you might be looking at. I'd say that all of the industry associations, including I count NCOSS as an industry association or a member organisation, all of those tend to be reputable. So all of those business associations, the charitable organisations, try and find ones obviously that are more relevant to you, but also I think look at some of what departments post the next day about budgets on social media and other places. But I think do look, a lot of those PR companies and others have clients across the whole range of these areas. And that's one of the reasons that they pull this stuff together for clients, and they often will put it out publicly. So I just have a look at some of those. So possibly not that helpful, Jessica, but really it's about signing up for newsletters and so forth. Try not to get overloaded.
Thanks, Catherine. Are there any other questions from anyone in the workshop today? Either feel free to put it in the chat or just put up your hand and you can ask verbally.
And I do apologise because it is a bit of an information dump, and it is a technical. They are designed to be technical papers, and they are. I think the thing I'd say about them is approach them very thoroughly, but approach them really clearly with what you want to find out from them, and look specifically for those things. Don't be distracted by the things that don't necessarily impact you or your sector, and really focus on the stuff that is critically important to you.
Yeah, so, just in terms, sorry, Jeff.
Sorry, just a question, I guess. So one of the things that I'm interested in is that at the present moment, the government requires for Homes New South Wales and Landcom to pay full commercial rates for any surplus government land that are being transferred. So New South Wales government's making a big thing about making land available for housing, and yet those agencies have to pay full dollar. Where would you expect to find any change in that sort of policy, which is an internal mechanism? Where would you expect to find that in the budget?
I'd expect that to find that probably in budget paper number 1, Jeff. There's a section in budget paper 1, and I'm just trying to, I better not, oh no, I'm stopped sharing. Where I would probably look at it in the budget paper number 1, there's a piece at the beginning, budget priorities. So I'd look at chapter 3, which is sort of budget priorities, delivering on our priorities, growth opportunities for our state. I'd also look at it in the infrastructure paper, because it does relate to infrastructure. If it's going to be in them, I'd look in there. I'd also do a quick rundown of budget paper 1, just to see if there are any other titles in there or chapters in there that might be of relevance. There's a reforms and initiatives of state-owned corporations, which potentially it could be in, but that would be where I'd first go and look for it, is budget paper 1, and also the infrastructure statement.
Thank you.
Catherine,
it would be nice. It would be nice to see that change, Jeff. I wasn't aware of that. That's not a good piece of policy at all.
Yeah, I mean, and the problem is that it means that it forces Land and Housing Corporation to go back to actually redevelop its own properties, because it's having to pay commercial rates for any of the surplus government land, because the Treasury has a requirement that the agency selling the land gets best value for it.
There's another question in the chat from Gareth, Catherine. So DCJ is often criticised for being unable to demonstrate outcomes, for example, in the child protection and out-of-home care system. What then is the relationship between the performance and wellbeing framework outcomes and budgeting decisions? Is it worth focusing on these outcomes?
Yeah, so I think, yes, it is, because I think one of the things, I think out-of-home care is one of the performance indicators that's in the performance framework, in the wellbeing and performance framework. And actually, it's probably, some of the measures in the DCJ are probably better than some of the other measures that are being used. I think the problem with that performance framework is it doesn't explicitly link, it will say, we're spending this money and these are the outcomes we're seeing, but it's not actually really explicit about how that link is being made. I think it's a real gap in that paper. So they're tracking, we're spending money, so they're not tracking that in the paper. They're actually just tracking the outcomes in the paper. So I think that explicit link between expenditure and outcomes is undercooked in the performance framework. I think it's one of the disappointing things in the framework. I mean, I'm an economist by training, and I spend a lot of my life trying to prove outcomes from government policies and programs, and I don't think that paper does it well. So I'm sorry. I'm as I said in the presentation, I'm really disappointed in that paper. I think the government had the opportunity to do something really different, a bit groundbreaking, and they completely did not. So sorry, Gareth, that's not a great answer either. But I do think it points to the fact that I'm really beginning to question how committed to the transparency element of a budget the people drawing these papers up are, because from my perspective, these papers are getting harder and harder to read. I was saying to Elise earlier, before you all got on the line, I said to my business partner, I was doing this presentation today, and he said, I haven't looked at those budget papers for a couple of years now. I'm not sure that I'd be able to read them properly anymore. And I think it is getting harder and harder to read them. And I can only come to the conclusion that that is deliberate.
And I think you were commenting as well, Catherine, that this is not, although New South Wales seems to be particularly bad in terms of the lack of transparency and detail in our budget papers, but this is not unique to New South Wales. This seems to be a trend right across other jurisdictions in Australia as well.
Yeah, I was saying to Elise, I do a very top line overview budget sort of every state budget in Australia for a couple of clients, and it's not their interest area, but I was doing the Tasmanian government one a couple of weeks ago, and I think they announced increase to funding for ambulance services, paramedics, and so forth about 3 different times in 3 different papers and in 3 different media releases, and bundled it every single time with a different measure. So every time they announced it by itself in one, and then every other time they announced it, which was at least twice, they bundled it with other measures as well. And I made the comment to the client that while it's not my job and it wasn't their interest, if I was actually interested in ambulance services in Tasmania and I wanted to unpick that, A, I wasn't sure whether I was going to be able to, and B, I reckon it would have taken me a few hours. And that's just an indication of, I think, that more and more governments are not trying to tell you what they're spending. They're trying to tell you the narrative about what they're trying to spend. And the narrative about health in Tasmania, I can assure you, is all about ambulance services. And yeah, but it was really dreadfully opaque. I do think your government is particularly bad on the transparency element, but they're not alone. It doesn't help, but I've spent most of my adult life, sadly, reading budget papers, and they are getting harder to read. So I've tried to give you an overview of how best to approach them, but I acknowledge the fact that they're getting harder.
Catherine, I have a question, a broader question about the budget cycle, that slide that you sort of took us through earlier. I noted that so often government will call for pre-budget submissions from the public or civil society or, the sectors like ours by sort of March. But based on your slide, obviously, the departmental budget submissions are going to government in December. So really, as advocates, should we be really looking at providing our pre-budget submissions to government in November to make sure that we're influencing those departmental submissions?
Yeah, so yeah, I think the earlier you engage with the departments, the better, to be honest. Federally, the budget submissions, public ones, close usually at the end of January. I think if anybody's not discussing those with their department in November, they're missing the boat, because in an ideal world, what you really want, so the budget cycle starts in that December time. The department will have their initial discussions with their minister. They'll work through ideas and priorities and so forth. They'll do all the assessment. They build up their budget submission. Ideally, you want to be in that budget submission. I mean, if you can be if the department's recommending your budget submission at the same time you go in and do it yourselves, you're already one step ahead of everybody else. So you want to be in that early part of this slide, even before. In that November, December, you want to be in there advocating to make sure that they're thinking about you. It doesn't always mean that you're going to get up, but being part of that budget submission is fantastic if you can make it. I had a situation recently, I'll be quite frank, at a federal budget level where I had we'd had those discussions with the Federal Department of Health in November, December. We actually provided our actual modelling to the department. They really wanted it. They asked for it in January. We gave it over. They were very excited about it. We're pretty confident we were part of the department's original submission. It didn't happen. I think we had a global war and disruption instead. But getting in there increased our chances massively for that particular organisation. So yes, seeding your ideas early not only gives you the opportunity to get your ideas in there, have those discussions, it also gives you the opportunity to get feedback about how interested is somebody about your idea, but also, are there any tweaks that they think? Listen to the questions that they ask if you're pitching something like that, because they might actually suggest tweaking it or where else you might fit. And it might mean that you realign or align slightly differently, either your language or potentially your entire proposal, you might actually add things to it, delete elements of it to make it actually fit more closely with what you can tell the departments are thinking. And that can be really helpful.
And then similarly, I guess on the other side of that, when we're thinking about the budget cycle and lack of transparency on budget day and in budget papers, what then do you see are the opportunities, particularly for us as NGO advocates, around the budget estimates hearing process and kind of influencing that process and the questions that are asked to ministers and departments during those hearings?
I think that's a really important piece. I think there are two elements about that. Oppositions like and want to be asking intelligent questions of those government departments. You know your areas far better than those opposition spokespeople and backbenchers and so forth will ever know. There's no, actually engaging with those people and putting forward questions to them to say, there's a lack of transparency about this. It would be really helpful if you could ask this and this, is actually perfectly legitimate. Governments expect it. They do it when they're in opposition. But building those relationships with both sides so that you can actually go and say, and I mean, I used to get regular emails when I did work, purely in government affairs, from people saying, oh gosh, those offices are really understaffed. Oh gosh, we haven't had time to prepare that well for next week. Do you guys, a group of stakeholders who they trusted, do you guys have anything that you'd like us to find out about? Because it makes them look like they're on top of their portfolio interests. So yes, I think there's a real opportunity to do that, to build those relationships and to get those questions asked, particularly the detail. I had a very many years ago, literally many years ago, I had a senator who really just continued at federal level to nail the government about a vaccines program, and did it over probably 2 to 3 years about what are you doing about this issue, and really was quite happy to put in very detailed questions. And the government knew, and they must have known, that that senator did not write those questions. It did not cause problems for our relationship, and it is part of the political process. It's expected. But estimates is a good chance to get that information. It's one of the few opportunities that you have. And I mean, again, a lot of departments will put things on notice and so forth. And if they do, keep chasing up with the person who asks the question about whether the department's responded to them in the statutory time frame that's required, because that person, again, might not have the time to follow up and might not keep track of those dates. But if you do it for them, you keep that pressure on and you might get better answers, or you should get better answers.
Thanks, Catherine. Are there any other questions from anyone on the line? If not, while people are sort of reflecting on what we've learned today, I'll just give an idea of what the next steps are in terms of budget day and what NCOSS is planning to do. So obviously budget day is on Tuesday, the 23rd of June. NCOSS will be in digital lockup from 9 a.m. till 12 p.m. And then the Treasurer gives his speech at about midday, and that's when sort of, everything gets released on the Treasury's website around budget papers for those who aren't in lockup. NCOSS will be sort of putting out our immediate response to the budget around midday following the Treasurer's speech. And then the next day we'll be publishing a more sort of detailed analysis, in response to what we had put forward as our pre-budget kind of priorities. We'll be putting out a document that sort of lists what we have asked for, what's actually in the budget, what it means for communities and what it means for our sector as well. So Jessica, I know you asked a question about that. Please keep an eye out for that. That'll be available on our website. And then, of course, following that, we'll have our post-budget breakfast event on the 1st of July as well. And that's an opportunity to get in the same room as the Treasurer and the Shadow Treasurer and ask questions about, the government's direction forward in terms of their investment. I think that pretty much covers what NCOSS is planning to do over the next week or so. I'm very happy if anyone sort of has any kind of follow-up questions about either this workshop or what NCOSS plans to do advocacy-wise around the budget, please do feel free to send me an email. I'll pop my email address in the chat. Otherwise, if there are no further questions, there's no need to hold you all here for longer than we need to. We can get a bit of our day back. Thank you so much again, Catherine, for running this workshop for us again. We find it so valuable and insightful every single year, and is such a good refresher for all of us leading up to the budget process, and to think more broadly and strategically about the whole budget cycle as well. So we really appreciate your time this morning, and appreciate the time of everyone else to come along to the workshop today as well.
Yeah, and just from me, you know, thank you as always for inviting me. I'm really passionate about this sector, and I think it's really critical that we get the outcomes that we're all looking for. So good luck for whatever it is that you're looking for, and may that happen. But B, if you've got any questions, Elisa's got my details, and I'm always really happy to take questions or to, you know, point you in the right direction, because as I say, it is all of our democracies, not just the politicians and the bureaucrats, and we really need to make it work and understand how it works to get the outcomes we need for the people we serve. So
thanks so much, Catherine. And I'll leave everyone with that message that you started with, that this is our money. So we all have a right to ask those questions about how it's being spent. So thanks so much for that, Catherine. We'll send out an email with the recording from today's workshop and the slides. So please keep an eye out for that. Have a great rest of your day. And I'll be speaking to some of you closer to budget day. Thanks, everyone.